Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to walk through a 10-step elk hunting checklist for becoming a more consistent elk hunter. And when I say consistent, I don't mean lucky once in a while. I do not mean having one good season, one close call, or one random encounter that keeps you motivated for the next 3 years. I mean becoming the kind of elk hunter who starts understanding why things happen, what matters most, and how to keep putting yourself in situations where elk opportunities show up more often, because that's the real goal. Most elk hunters are not struggling because they don't care enough. They are struggling because their elk hunting is too fragmented. They might be doing some things right. They might be training hard. They might be shooting a lot. They might spend hours on maps. Maybe they hike a ton once season starts. But if those things are disconnected, the result is inconsistency. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent elk hunter and outdoorsman. So in this episode, I want to give you a complete checklist, not just for finding elk, but for building the kind of hunt that actually holds together when pressure hits, when conditions change, and when the mountain starts punching back, because consistent elk hunters do not rely on hope. They rely on structure and a system. Step one, stop chasing random success and build a system. The first step to becoming a consistent elk hunter is understanding that consistency does not come from isolated wins. It comes from structure. This is one of the biggest differences between elk hunters who occasionally get lucky and elk hunters who keep finding themselves in position year after year. The lucky hunter remembers moments. The consistent elk hunter understands it's a process. A lot of elk hunters are building their entire identity around random outcomes. They killed one bull after hearing a bugle at daylight, so now they think that's the key. They got into elk once after hiking 4 miles past everybody else, so now they believe further always means better. They arrowed a bull after making an aggressive move, so now they think aggression is always the answer. But elk hunting does not work that way. There is no always or never. One outcome does not prove a pattern. That's where a lot of elk hunters get trapped. They take a moment that happened under one set of conditions and turn that into a rule. Then they spend years forcing that rule into situations where it no longer applies. And that's how inconsistency gets built. Not because the hunter lacks effort, but because the hunter is building on unstable information. If you want to become consistent, you need a system that works across different terrain, different pressure levels, different seasons, and different tag types. That system has to be simple enough to use under stress, but strong enough to hold up when things are not going according to plan. For me, that always comes back to the same sequence: locate, evaluate, position, execute, and then adjust. This is not just a catchy framework. This is how you remove some of the randomness from elk hunting. First, you locate elk or likely elk use. That does not always mean seeing elk. It can mean identifying where they should be based on terrain, pressure, timing, wind, feed, security, and movement structure. Then you evaluate. What are the actual conditions here? What is pressure doing? What are thermals doing? Is this still a huntable area in daylight? Is this sign current enough to matter right now? Is this a place to commit or just a place to confirm and then move on? Then you position. This is where a lot of opportunities are either created or destroyed. Positioning is not about getting close for the sake of getting close. It's not what we're talking about. It's about getting where the encounter should happen if your read is correct. That may mean above, below, lateral, inside the timber, on the edge, or waiting on a transition route instead of just charging forward and constantly calling. Then you execute. That might mean calling. That might mean still hunting. That might mean sitting on a movement route or slipping into a setup, glassing patiently, or making a shooting decision when the moment comes. Then you adjust. This is the part a lot of hunters skip. Instead of learning from what just happened, they reset emotionally and they just start over without learning. But consistency is built by stacking information. Every interaction with elk, every missed chance, every empty basin, every wind shift, every silent timber timber pocket tells you something. The hunter who can adjust intelligently gets better fast. The hunter who resets every morning and doesn't try to learn from all those experiences, they stay stuck. This matters because elk hunting is not just about finding elk, it's about building control. You're never going to control everything. You're not going to control weather, pressure, tag numbers, wolf presence, access, or what another hunter does on the ridge across from you. But consistent hunters control what they can: preparation, physical readiness, shooting confidence, decision making, movement discipline, patience, and the ability to interpret what the mountain is telling them. That's a big difference. A hunter without a system wakes up every day asking, "What should I do? Where should I go today?" A hunter with a system wakes up asking, "What does the situation require today?" That one shift can change everything for you because elk hunting punishes emotional hunting. It punishes ego, it punishes panic, and it punishes the need to always feel active. A lot of elk hunters move because movement makes them feel productive. They relocate because staying put feels uncomfortable, or they push because backing out feels weak. They abandon areas too early because nothing happened fast enough. But that is not structure. That's just reaction. And reaction is the enemy of elk killing consistency. If you want this season to be different, stop asking whether you know enough tactics and stop asking whether you need one more calling tip or one more gear item or one more secret basin, and start asking whether your entire hunt is actually connected by a real system. Can you explain how your e-scouting connects to your first day plan? Can you explain how your physical fitness supports your terrain choices? Can you explain how your shooting practice matches the shots you're likely to face in the field? Can you explain how your understanding of elk behavior can change your timing, your route, your setup, even your patience? If those pieces are disconnected, your hunt is going to feel disconnected too. And that's why this checklist matters. You don't become consistent by doing one thing better. You become consistent by making sure the whole hunt makes sense. Preparation, scouting, movement, shooting, behavior, pressure, and decision making all have to support one another. That's step one. Stop chasing random success. Build something repeatable, because consistent elk hunters are not the guys who know the most random facts or shoot the furthest or hike the deepest. They're the guys who have built a structure strong enough to keep working when the easy version of the hunt disappears. And in elk hunting, the easy version always disappears fast. The second step here in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to e-scout the right way. And this is where a lot of elk hunters are putting in effort but not getting results, because most guys are not failing at e-scouting due to lack of time. They're failing because they're looking for the wrong thing. They open up a map and start marking elk-looking areas, right? Big basins, north-facing timber, meadows, water sources, maybe bedding zones. And on the surface, that makes sense. Those are all places elk can be, but that's not the problem. You're identifying where elk could exist, not where you can actually kill one. And those are not the same thing, right? Because elk are not static. They don't live in one pen. They move constantly between feed, bed, security, and pressure response. And the only time they're truly vulnerable is when they're transitioning between those things. That's where the most opportunity exists. So the shift you need to make is simple, but it changes everything here. Stop scouting for locations, start scouting for elk movement. When you open a map now, instead of asking where would elk be, you need to start asking, how do elk move through this terrain or through this area? And that forces you to look at terrain completely differently. Now you're not just seeing a basin, you're asking how elk enter it, how they leave it, where they travel through it, and what forces them to make decisions inside it. You're looking for structure, benches that allow side hill travel without exposure, saddles that connect two drainages and funnel movement, finger ridges that create natural travel corridors, transitions between thick timber and open feed, edges where elk can move while staying concealed. Those are not random features, right? Those are movement tools, and elk use those over and over again because they offer efficiency and security and wind advantage, and that's what creates pattern. The next piece is understanding where that movement becomes the most predictable. And that comes down to decision points. Those are places where elk have to choose a direction. Maybe it's a bench that ends and forces them to go up or down, right? Maybe it's a saddle that gives them two options in separate basins. Maybe a side hill that tightens into a narrow contour band, or maybe a transition from feeding to bedding that creates a natural choke point for you. I have a whole video on that. It's one of our most successful hunting tactics. And those are places you can actually hunt because movement compresses there. Instead of just trying to cover an entire basin, you can position on a couple 100-yard stretch that elk are far more likely to pass through. And that's how you move from hoping to finding more elk and getting more encounters to setting up where they actually should show up. Now, the next mistake a lot of elk hunters make is stopping there, right? They find movement patterns, then they find a decision point and they drop their pin. But that still might not be enough because a pin without a plan is just a guess. Every single location you mark needs to answer three questions before it really matters, right? Where do I set up? What makes wind work in this area? And what time does this matter, right? If you can't answer those questions, then you don't have a real hunting spot yet. You have a possibility. Possibilities don't always kill elk. Having a good plan does. So now when you're e-scouting, you need to go one level deeper. You're not just identifying movement, you're pre-building your hunt out, right? Pre-planning that. You're above the movement or below it. You're using morning thermals or evening thermals. Is this a first light setup, a mid-morning transition, or a last light opportunity? What happens if the wind shifts? Where do you go next if this doesn't produce? Now your map starts turning into something different. It's no longer a collection of pins, it's a series of decisions you've already made before you step into the mountains. And that changes everything once season starts, right? Because instead of wandering into an area and trying to figure it out in real time, you already know how that terrain should hunt. You already know where you should go, when to be there, and what needs to happen for it to work. That eliminates a lot of hesitation and a lot of wasted time. It speeds up your decisions and it keeps you from wasting time bouncing between spots that never had a real plan behind them in the first place. The final piece of this is building multiple options, not just one perfect area. A lot of elk hunters fall into the trap of finding one basin they believe in and putting all their confidence into it. And when that basin doesn't produce because of pressure, weather, timing, or elk simply not being there, they don't have a backup plan. And that's how seasons fall apart quickly. Instead, you need a handful of areas that follow the same structure: movement, those decision points, where's the wind alignment, and clear setup positions, right? Now you're not relying on one spot to save your hunt. You're running a system across multiple areas, and that's what creates more consistency because elk hunting is not about finding the perfect place. It's about building a map that actually translates into real decisions once you're in the field. That's when e-scouting starts working. Not when you have more pins, but when every pin means something. Step number three is to get physically ready for the hunt you actually drew. The third step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is getting physically prepared, but not in the way a lot of elk hunters think, because physical fitness in elk hunting is not just about how hard you can suffer, right? It's about how well you can perform when it matters. A lot of elk hunters approach training with a very general mindset. They might run more, they might hike more, they might try to get in better shape generally. And while that helps, one is greater than zero, it often misses the real goal. You don't need to be in great shape for elk hunting. You need to be in the right shape for the elk hunt you actually drew, because not all elk hunts demand the same things. Some elk hunts require long, steep climbs at elevation. Some require side hilling for miles through uneven terrain. Some require slow, controlled movement through timber and deadfall. Some demand repeated climbs, packouts, and heavy load management. If your training doesn't match your terrain, your performance is going to fall apart when it matters. And when your body breaks down, your decision making follows it. So that's where opportunities can get lost. You rush because you're tired. You leave areas too quickly because you're gassed. You take the easier route instead of the right one. You avoid pushing into terrain that actually holds elk. That's not a hunting problem, that's a physical preparation problem. So the shift here has to be stop training generally and start training more specifically. The law of specificity. You need to prepare your body for three things above everything else: sustained movement, load handling, and control under fatigue. Sustained movement means you can cover ground all day without falling apart, not just one hard push, but multiple days of consistent effort without losing sharpness. Load handling means you can carry weight efficiently, whether that's your pack going in or meat coming out. Your body needs to be ready to move under load without breaking down or changing your movement patterns. And control under fatigue is what most people overlook, because elk opportunities rarely show up when you're fresh. They show up after a climb, after a long side hill, after hours of effort or days of effort, when your legs are tired, your breathing's elevated, and your heart rate's up. And that's when you need to move quietly, position precisely, and execute a shot. If your training doesn't prepare you for that moment, it's going to expose you. And that's why strength training matters here. Not for aesthetics, we're not bodybuilding, not for numbers in the gym, but for durability. Stronger legs handle elevation better. A stronger core stabilizes you under a pack. Better posterior chain strength improves your climbing and descending. Upper body strength supports pack outs and weapon control. Strength gives you margin, and margin keeps you effective longer in the hunt. The next piece is movement efficiency. Elk hunting is not a straight line of activity, right? It's uneven, unstable, constantly changing in terrain: rocks, deadfall, loose dirt, side hills. Your body has to adapt to all of it. If you've only trained on flat ground or machines, that transition is going to hit you hard. That's why things like step ups, lunges, loaded carries, and uneven terrain hiking matter a lot. They build the kind of movement patterns you actually use in the field, and that translates directly into how quietly and efficiently you can move when you're in elk, because noise, balance, and control all matter once you're in close, right? Now let's talk about elevation. If you're coming from lower elevation, this is a factor you cannot ignore. You don't have to live at altitude, but you do need to respect it. Your pacing has to adjust, your expectations have to adjust, and your fitness has to support those adjustments. If you come in underprepared, elevation is going to slow you down, it's going to chew you up. And again, that affects your decision making. You'll cut hunts short, you'll avoid certain terrain, you'll settle for less. And elk hunting does not reward that. The final piece of this is recovery. Consistency in elk hunting isn't built in one day, it's built across the entire hunt. If you burn yourself out on day one or two, the rest of the hunt is going to suffer. That means you've got to fuel properly, you've got to hydrate consistently, you've got to manage effort instead of emptying the tank every single day, because the goal is not to prove how tough you are out there. The goal is to stay effective, to be the killer for as many days as it takes. That's how consistent elk hunters operate. They don't just go hard, they last. And that's what physical preparation should give you. Not just the ability to push, but the ability to perform day after day without losing your sharpness. Because when your body's ready, everything else is going to become easier. Your decisions get clearer, your movement gets quieter, your confidence goes up, and when the opportunity finally shows up, you're going to be ready for it. That's the standard. Train for the hunt you drew to be optimal for that hunt, not some hunt that you're imagining. Step number 4, build a shooting system you can trust under pressure. This is the fourth step in becoming a consistent elk hunter, and that's building the shooting system, not just practicing shooting, because there's a big difference. Most elk hunters shoot enough to feel confident, but not enough to be reliable when it actually matters. And elk hunting has a way of exposing that gap pretty fast. Shots don't happen on flat ground most of the time. They don't happen when you're calm and rested. They don't happen with perfect footing and unlimited time. They happen when your heart rate's up, when your legs are tired, when the angle isn't perfect, when the window's small, and when you know this might be your only chance. That's pressure. And if your shooting practice doesn't prepare you for that moment, it's not enough. So the shift here is stop practicing shooting and start building a shooting system. A system means you know exactly how you're going to execute a shot every single time, no matter the conditions. It starts with consistency: your setup, your grip, your anchor point, your trigger or release execution, your follow through. Those things need to be repeatable, not just when everything feels right and perfect on the range, but when it doesn't. Because under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back to your level of habits. If your habits are inconsistent, your results are going to be inconsistent too. The next piece is realism. You need to train the way you're going to hunt. That means shooting from uneven terrain, kneeling, sitting, and off balance positions, elevated or downhill angles, tight shooting lanes, because elk don't step into perfect shooting lanes hardly ever. And if the first time you try to take a shot like that is in the field, you're just guessing. The next layer is fatigue. This is where most people miss it. You need to practice shooting when you're tired, after a hike, after a workout, after your heart rate is elevated, because that's when elk opportunities usually show up. If you only shoot when you're fresh, you're building confidence in a false version of yourself that doesn't exist during the hunt. You need to know how your body reacts under pressure and how to control it. Breathing matters here, right? You can slow your breathing enough to settle your shot, but can you in the moment? Can you control your movement when your heart rate is pounding? Can you stay disciplined instead of rushing the shot? That's the difference between hitting the target and executing when it counts. The next piece is decision making. A shooting system is not just about how you shoot, it's about when you shoot, knowing your effective range, knowing your angles, knowing when to pass. A lot of opportunities are lost, not because the hunter can't shoot, but because they take shots that they probably shouldn't. Maybe it's too far, maybe it's too rushed, maybe they're just uncertain about distance or branches. Consistent elk hunters are more disciplined. They don't force shots, they wait for the right ones, because one bad decision can end that opportunity or worse, wound an animal. The final piece here is confidence. Not blind confidence, but earned confidence. Confidence that comes from a lot of repetition, from seeing your system work over and over again, from knowing what you can do and probably what you shouldn't attempt. That kind of confidence keeps you calm when the moment shows up. It's going to slow things down for you and keep you from rushing. It allows you to execute instead of react. And that's what matters a lot here, because elk hunting doesn't give you unlimited chances. When the opportunity shows up, it has to count a lot of times. So build a system you trust, one that holds up when you're tired, when the terrain is off, and when the pressure is real, because consistent elk hunters don't just get opportunities, they capitalize on them. Step number 5 is to understand elk behavior before you worry about tactics. This 5th step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is really important, might be the most important. That's understanding elk behavior and putting ahead of everything else, before tactics, before gear, before calling strategies, because this is where most elk hunters build their hunt backwards. They start with what they're going to do. What call should I use? Where should I set up? How aggressive should I be? They focus on execution before they actually understand the situation that they could be in. And that's where things fall apart, because tactics are tools, and tools only work when they're applied in the right conditions. If you don't understand what elk are doing, why they're doing it, and how the environment is shaping that behavior, then every tactic you use is just a guess. Sometimes it's going to work. A lot of times it doesn't. And that's why you can have the right tactic and still fail. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong conditions. So the shift is simple. Stop asking, what should I do? And start asking, what are elk doing right now? Because elk behavior is not random, it's structured around survival. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and post-rut. We're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory. It's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Every decision elk make, where they feed, where they bed, how they move, how they use wind, is tied to one goal: stay alive. That's the lens you've got to start applying to this. At the most basic level, elk operate in a feed to bed to feed cycle, right? They move from feeding areas into secure bedding zones, then they transition back out again in the evening. And that cycle is influenced by time of day, pressure, weather, and terrain. But the mistake a lot of elk hunters make is stopping at that surface level understanding. They know elk feed and they know they bed, but they don't understand how elk move between those points. And that's where opportunity actually exists a lot of times, especially early season. Elk are most vulnerable when they move, not when they're necessarily feeding in more open country, right? And a lot of times that's at night anyway, not when they're locked into bedding cover during the day. Stalking on bedded elk can be tough, especially when there's a bunch of eyeballs and noses. But when they transition, they're vulnerable. Those transitions are not random. Elk use terrain to their advantage, right? They travel along benches because it allows efficient side hill movement. They use saddles because they connect drainages. They follow edge cover because it provides security while they're moving. They avoid exposure at all costs unless conditions allow for it and they feel confident. Over time, those routes are going to become consistent, not because elk are careless, but because those terrain features consistently offer them the best chance to survive. And that's what creates the pattern for us. The next layer is pressure, because elk behavior changes fast when hunting season starts. Under pressure, elk don't just disappear, they compress and adjust quickly. They reduce their movement during daylight. They shift into thicker, more secure terrain. They become more cautious with how and when they move. And this is where a lot of elk hunters get it wrong. They keep hunting elk the same way they would in low pressure conditions. They expect the same movement, the same visibility, the same responses, but the elk have already adjusted. And if you don't adjust with them, you're going to fall behind. Understanding pressure is critical here because it tells you where elk are likely to be, when they're likely to move, and how cautious they're going to be. And that directly affects how you hunt them. The next piece is wind, and it's huge. Elk don't just react to wind, they use it, they live by it. When they bed, how they position themselves to take advantage of both prevailing wind and thermals. And typically, they'll set up with wind at their back and thermals in front, giving them the ability to detect danger from multiple directions. When they travel, they choose routes that allow them to maintain that advantage. And when something doesn't feel right, they often adjust immediately. That's why so many encounters get blown out. Not just because the hunter didn't care or was careless, but because they didn't fully understand how elk were using the wind in that moment. And the final piece here is visibility. Elk don't disappear. They just become harder to see because they've moved into harder places to find them. They shift into terrain that limits exposure, or they tuck into dark timber, or they use broken ground that disrupts line of sight for hunters. And most elk hunters keep looking in the same obvious places like open basins and meadows and more glassable slopes. So when elk leave those areas, hunters assume they're gone. But they're usually not. They're just positioned differently than we expect. Once you understand that, your entire approach can change. You can stop chasing what's easy to see and you start hunting where elk can exist without being visible. And that's a completely different approach. And that's where consistency starts to build, because now your decisions are based on reality, not just assumptions. And that's the key. Elk hunting is not about knowing more tactics. It's about understanding that behavior at a deeper level, because once you understand what elk are doing, everything else becomes more clear. Your movement, your positioning, your timing, your setups, it all starts to make sense. And that's when tactics finally start working. Not because you found a better one, but because you're using them at the right time, in the right place, for the right reason. That's the difference between guessing and understanding. Step into the backcountry and step up your elk hunting game at Elk Camp 2026. This isn't a seminar. It's an immersive experience with real field training alongside successful elk hunters Matt and Saxton Hartsky. You'll learn how elk think and move, break down terrain like a pro, call with confidence, and practice 3 days of real-world elk hunting scenarios that mirror what you'll face on your own hunt. This camp was built to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be in the mountains. With limited spots and hands-on coaching, you'll walk away sharper, more prepared, and ready to hunt with purpose and confidence. Elk Camp 2026. Sharpen your edge. Register now and prepare for the season like never before at backboneunlimited.com. Step number 6 is learn to hunt wind, thermals, and terrain together. This sixth step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to hunt wind, thermals, and terrain as one system, not as separate pieces, because this is where more encounters fall apart than almost anything else. Most elk hunters think they're playing the wind. They check it with a puff bottle. They try to stay downwind. They adjust when it shifts. And that's a good start. But oftentimes it's not enough because wind in the mountains is not simple. It's not just steady. It's not predictable in a straight line a lot of times. It's not something you can manage by just checking it once and hoping it holds and forgetting about it. Wind is constantly interacting with the terrain, and thermals are constantly changing based on the time of day, also sunlight, also elevation, slope angle, vegetation. If you don't understand how all those things work together, you're always going to be guessing, and guessing gets you busted by the wind. So the shift is this: stop reacting to wind and start anticipating it. Start checking it more often. That starts with understanding thermals. In the simplest terms, I hear folks say all the time, morning thermals rise, evening thermals fall. Yes, but as the sun heats up the ground, air begins to move uphill. As temperatures drop, air cools, and those begin to fall downhill, right? That creates a daily pattern. But here's where a lot of elk hunters get it wrong. They treat that pattern like just a clean cut, simple flip the switch rule instead of a trend and a transition through those times, because thermals are influenced by terrain. For instance, a steep sunlit slope is going to heat faster and pull air up sooner, but a shaded north facing slope might hold falling thermals longer into the morning. Deep timber can delay thermal movement. Open slopes can accelerate it. And that means thermals don't flip at the same time everywhere. They shift in layers. And if you're not paying attention to that, you're going to walk into situations where the wind feels right at one elevation and completely wrong 100 yards higher or lower. That's how encounters get blown without even realizing. Now add terrain to that. Terrain shapes airflow. So just because you have directional wind or directional thermals, ridges can split the wind, drainages can funnel it, benches can hold swirling air, side hills can create lateral movement instead of straight up or down. So now you're not just dealing with rising or falling air, you're dealing with how that air is being redirected by the landscape, and elk know how to use that. They position themselves where they can take advantage of it. When elk bed, they often set up with wind at their back and thermals in front, like we talked about earlier. That gives them 2 layers of protection. They can smell what's coming from behind them and monitor what's below them or above them, depending on whether the thermals are rising or falling. If something approaches from the wrong direction, a lot of times they know it before they ever see it. And that's not random, that's calculated elk positioning. And if you don't understand that, a lot of times you can walk right into their advantage. Now let's talk about how this affects your hunting, because this is where the system comes together. Every movement you make needs to be based on how wind, thermals, and terrain are going to behave, not how they feel in the moment. Before you move, you need to ask, what are the thermals doing right now? What is it going to do in the next 30 to 60 minutes? How is this terrain going to influence that movement? Where will my scent go if I move through this particular route? If you can't answer those, then you're guessing, and elk are going to expose those guesses. And that's why positioning matters more than movement. A lot of hunters try to close distance aggressively. They move fast, they push in, they try to get on top of elk. But if your wind isn't right, distance doesn't matter. You can be 200 yards away and invisible, or 600 yards away and already busted. That's the difference. Wind decides the encounter. So instead of asking, how do I get closer? You need to start asking, how do I get into position where my wind also holds? Sometimes that means slowing down. Sometimes it means stopping completely. Sometimes it means backing out and coming in from a completely different direction. That's hunting discipline. And it's one of the hardest things for elk hunters to do because it feels like you're giving up ground. But in reality, you're protecting the opportunity. The next layer is understanding how elk use wind when they move. Elk don't just travel through terrain randomly, right? They choose routes that allow them to maintain a scent advantage. They'll side hill with wind in their favor. They'll use transitions that allow them to monitor multiple directions. And mature bulls will often circle downwind before committing to anything like a call. That circling behavior is what blows a lot of encounters. You think the wind is good because it's in your face, but the elk isn't coming straight in a lot of times. He's trying to figure out your wind. And if you haven't accounted for that, it's over before it starts. And that's why setups really matter. You need to position yourself in a way that accounts for how elk are going to use that wind, not just how you are, right? Where can they circle? Where will your scent drift if they do? What terrain feature can limit that movement or give you an advantage? That's how you start thinking differently. The final piece here is accepting that perfect wind probably doesn't exist. There will always be variability, there will always be shifts. Your goal is not to eliminate that. Your goal is to manage it. Stay in positions where your wind is as predictable as possible. Avoid areas where wind becomes chaotic. Recognize when conditions are no longer huntable and adjust, because sometimes the best decision is not to push, it's to wait or move to a different setup entirely. That's what consistent elk hunters do. They don't force bad conditions, they work within what the mountain is giving them, because at the end of the day, wind is not just a factor, it's the factor. You can get everything else right. You can find elk, position yourself correctly, move quietly, and be in the perfect spot at the perfect time. But if your wind fails, you fail. So stop treating wind, thermals, and terrain as separate ideas and start hunting them as one system, because that's how elk are using them. And once you understand that, your encounters are going to start lasting longer and turn into real opportunities instead of blowouts. Step number 7, stop wasting time in country that only looks good. The seventh step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to separate what looks good from what actually functions for elk, because this is one of the biggest time wasters in elk country, and almost every elk hunter falls into it. You open a map or step into a unit and you see everything you've been told to look for: big basins, open parks, north facing timber, water nearby, feed everywhere. It checks all the boxes. It looks like elk country. And because of that, you commit to it. You hike into it, you glass it, you move through it, you keep coming back to it because it should hold elk, but nothing happens. And the mistake a lot of elk hunters make is thinking, I just haven't hit at the right time yet. So they keep going back to it. They keep investing time into country that's capable of holding elk, but isn't being used the way they think. That's where seasons start slipping away, spending too much time in a place like that, because you're not hunting reality. You're just hunting appearance. And elk don't prioritize what looks good to us. They prioritize what keeps them alive. That's the shift you have to make. Stop asking, does this look like elk country? And start asking, does this function for elk right now? Because under pressure, elk don't choose the most obvious terrain. They choose terrain that gives them an advantage. And that usually means more thicker cover, broken terrain, edge environments, limited visibility, better wind control, quick escape routes. And most of the time, those areas are not the prettiest. They're not the easiest to glass. They're not the most enjoyable to hike through, that's for sure. They're not the places you naturally want to spend your time, but they're the places elk shift into when pressure builds. And that's why a lot of elk hunters lose consistency. They stay committed to good looking country for too long instead of recognizing when that country is no longer producing and then adjusting. They double down on it because it's comfortable, because it matches what they expect, because it feels like it should work. But elk hunting doesn't reward what should work. It rewards what is working, what's going to work based on today's conditions. You need a filter. Every piece of terrain you hunt should answer a few critical questions. Is this area providing security during daylight? Is it positioned in a way that allows elk to manage wind effectively? Is it insulated from pressure or directly exposed to it? Does it connect to bedding, feeding, escape routes in a way that makes sense to elk? If the answer is no to those questions, then it doesn't matter how good it looks. It's probably not a high value area. The next piece is understanding how pressure changes terrain use. Early in the season, elk might use more open, visible terrain, sure, but as pressure increases, they shift. They move into mid slope benches, thick north facing timber, broken side hills, hidden pockets near access, places where they can monitor movement and avoid pressure. And here's where it gets interesting. interesting. A lot of those places are closer to pressure than you might think because a lot of elk hunters push deeper trying to get away from people. And in doing that, they skip over elk that have already adjusted to that exact movement pattern. So now you have hunters hiking further into pretty country, while elk are holding in less obvious terrain closer to where pressure is coming from. That's the disconnect. And that's why you can be in perfect country and not see elk because you're hunting based on appearance, not real time behavior. The next mistake is overvaluing glassability. Hunters love areas they can see into, big open basins, long sight lines, clean edges, because it feels productive. You can cover a lot of country quickly, but elk don't care about your ability to see them, right? In fact, under pressure, they probably actively avoid those places. They move into terrain that limits visibility. So if you're only hunting areas that are easy to glass, you're automatically eliminating a large percentage of where elk are actually spending daylight hours. That doesn't mean you abandon glassing. It means you stop relying on it as your primary filter. And in a lot of places, guys don't have glassing areas anyway, right? So you just use it as a tool, not a crutch. And the final piece here is knowing when to leave an area. This is one of the hardest things for elk hunters to do because once you're invested and you've put time into an area, it's really hard to walk away. You've hiked in, you've scouted it, you've visualized success there, and leaving feels like starting over. But staying too long in the wrong place that's empty is one of the fastest ways to waste a hunt. Consistent elk hunters are willing to move on, not emotionally, but based on current information. If an area is not producing sign, movement, or conditions that make sense over time, they've got to adjust. They don't wait for something to happen just because it looks good. They trust what the mountain is telling them, and they move with purpose because time is your most valuable resource in elk hunting. And every hour spent in the wrong place is an hour you're not in the right one. That's the difference. You don't become consistent by finding better looking country. You become consistent by identifying what country actually works and being disciplined enough to hunt it, even when it's not obvious, even when it's not comfortable, even when it doesn't match what you expected. Because elk don't live in pretty, they live in places that give them the advantage. And once you start hunting those places instead, everything absolutely changes. Step number 8, know how to locate, evaluate, and reposition in real time. The eighth step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to operate in real time because no matter how good your preparation is, the mountain is going to change things. Your plan will not survive intact. Conditions are going to shift, pressure changes, elk move differently than expected, and that's where a lot of, elk hunts either come together or fall apart because most hunters don't have a process for what to do once they're in the field. They have a plan, but they don't have a system for adapting that plan. So when things don't match what they expected, they default to one of two things. They either stay too long or they leave too early, and both of those can kill opportunities. That's why this step matters. You need a repeatable system, a repeatable way to locate, evaluate, and reposition, not once, but continuously throughout the hunt. First, locate, but understand what that really means. Locating is not just about hearing a bugle or spotting elk. That's part of it, but it's not the whole picture. Locating is about confirming whether elk are using an area in a way that's huntable right now. That could be really fresh sign, tracks and poop, rub lines, feeding activity, movement corridors, thermal patterns that make sense, terrain that supports security. You're building a picture, and here's the key. You're not just asking, are elk here? You're asking, are elk here in a way I can hunt? Because elk being present and elk being killable are two different things. A basin full of night activity doesn't help you during legal shooting light a lot of times. So your job is to locate usable, huntable elk. Second, evaluate. This is where a lot of hunters fail. Once you locate something, you need to evaluate it correctly. And this is where a lot of elk hunters make emotional decisions. They might find sign and they just commit to it. They don't step back and ask, what is the timing here? What is the wind doing? Is this a feeding area or a transition? Is this daylight activity or just leftover sign from the night? Is pressure influencing this right now? Without all of that evaluation, you're just reacting. And like we've talked about before, reaction puts you out of position. It just keeps you behind the elk, right? Evaluation slows you down just enough to think about it clearly because not every piece of sign is equal. Not every area is worth committing to. Some areas are confirm and move, or observe and wait, or commit and hunt. And if you don't know the difference, you might be wasting your time. Third, Reposition. This is where opportunities are created or lost. This is the most important part and the part a lot of elk hunters struggle with. Repositioning is not random movement, it's controlled adjustment based on information. And this is where the system separates you from the average hunter. Most elk hunters move like this: I didn't see anything, I'm going somewhere else. That's not a reposition, that's a reset. A reset kills momentum. A real reposition answers, where are the elk going next? Where can I intercept them and intercept that movement and anticipate it? How do I get there without blowing them out? You're always thinking ahead of the elk, not behind them. If you hear a bugle, don't just move toward it. Ask, where is that bugle going? What terrain is he using? Where will he end up based on wind and timing? Then move to your location. That's interception, not chasing. If you find first sign but no elk, don't abandon the area immediately, but ask, what time was this made? Where would they be now? What terrain supports this movement? Then reposition yourself accordingly. That's how you stay in the elk. The biggest mistake here is resetting every day. A lot of elk hunters treat every day like a brand new hunt. New area, new plan, new approach. That's a problem because consistency comes from stacking information, not just restarting all the time. Every day should build on the last. You should know more on day 3 than you did on day 1. You should be narrowing your focus, not just expanding it. That's how momentum builds. That's how patterns start to show up. And that's how you stop guessing. Real-time hunting is controlled, not chaotic. When you put this all together, your hunt starts to feel different. You're not just wandering. You're not reacting emotionally. You're not second-guessing every move. You're making decisions based on what you're seeing, what you're learning, and how elk actually behave. And that creates control. Not perfect outcomes by any means, no guarantees, but better controlled decisions. And controlled decisions lead to more consistent opportunities. The bottom line here is that you don't become consistent because your plan was perfect. You become consistent because you know how to adjust when it's not. That's the difference. Anybody can follow a plan when things go right and smooth, but elk hunting is about what you do when things don't match your expectations. So build your ability to locate intelligently, evaluate correctly, and reposition with purpose, because that's what keeps you an elk and that's what turns effort into results. Step number 9, hunt with discipline when things start going wrong. The 9th step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to stay disciplined when things start breaking down, because they will. I guarantee you, you will have days where you don't hear elk. You will have setups that don't come together. You will get the wind wrong. You will make a move that doesn't work. That's all part of elk hunting. And here's the difference: inconsistent hunters fall apart when those things go wrong. Consistent elk hunters tighten everything up. And that shift is everything. Let me explain more. When things go wrong, most hunters speed up. This is one of the biggest patterns you'll see. The longer things don't work, the faster hunters start moving. They cover more ground. They make quicker decisions. They push into areas without thinking it through. They abandon structure because they're trying to force something to happen. It feels productive, but it's not. It's reaction. And reaction destroys your positioning, because now you're not hunting elk. You're just chasing a feeling. You're trying to fix frustration instead of solving the problem. And that's when mistakes stack up. Discipline is doing the right thing, not the easy thing, in life and in elk hunting, right? When things start going wrong, your instinct is going to pull you towards more movement, more aggression, more urgency. But discipline pulls you in the opposite direction. You slow down, you evaluate better, you stick to the system you built, because the right move is rarely the emotional one. Sometimes discipline means staying in an area longer than you want to. Sometimes it means backing out when everything in you wants to push. Sometimes it means passing on a shot. Sometimes it means not calling. And that's what separates consistent hunters. They don't let emotion dictate their decisions. They stay anchored to structure. This is where a lot of opportunities are lost. Not at the shot necessarily, not because elk are impossible, but because the hunter breaks down before the opportunity develops. They push too fast. They blow out elk. They might leave too early. They take low percentage shots. They abandon areas that were about to produce. And it all comes from the same place: Loss of discipline, because elk hunting rewards patience and precision, not panic. You have to trust the process before you see results. This is one of the hardest parts because there are long stretches where it feels like nothing at all is working. And if you don't trust what you're doing in your system, you're going to start changing things constantly. New area, new tactic, new approach, but that resets your progress every single time. Consistency is built when you allow things to develop, when you give your positioning time to work, when you let elk move into your setup, when you stay connected to the area long enough to understand it. That's how momentum builds. Discipline keeps you in position long enough to win. Elk hunting is not instant, right? We know that. Opportunities have to build, they develop over time. And if you're constantly breaking structure, you never stay in position long enough for that to happen. That's why disciplined elk hunters seem to get lucky. They don't just get lucky. They're just still there when everything happens. Mental control is a skill, not a trait. A lot of people think discipline is something you either have or you don't, and I don't believe that that's true. I believe it's a skill, and like anything else, it can be trained. You build it by sticking to your system, making decisions based on information, not emotion, recognizing when you're reacting instead of actually thinking it through, and then correcting in real time. The more you do that, the stronger it gets. Things are going to go wrong, and that's not the problem. How you respond to it absolutely is, because every hunter deals with setbacks, but only consistent hunters stay composed through all of those. They don't speed up, they don't panic, they don't abandon structure, they stay more disciplined. And because of that, they stay in the hunt, and that's the difference. Step number 10: track information until opportunity becomes repeatable. The 10th step in becoming a consistent elk hunter is learning how to stack information, because this is where everything starts to come together. This is the difference between hunting feeling random and hunting starting to make sense. Most elk hunters never get there. Success rates show us that. Not because they're not capable, because they're not because they're not capable, but because they never build momentum. They reset every day. New area, new plan, new approach. And because of that, nothing really connects. They have experiences, but no pattern. They have effort, but no direction. And that's why everything feels so inconsistent and random. Consistency comes from building, not restarting. Every day in the field is giving you information. You have to use it. You might be getting movement timing or wind behavior, pressure patterns, terrain use, where elk show up and where they don't. But that information only matters if you keep it connected. If you treat every day like a clean slate, you're going to throw that away. And when you do that, you stay stuck in the same cycle. Stop restarting and start stacking. Let's say you move into an area and don't see elk. Most elk hunters think, nothing here, I need to move. But a consistent elk hunter asks, what did I just learn? Maybe you learned elk are not using that basin during daylight, or the wind is unstable in that drainage, or pressure is higher than expected, or movement is happening later than you thought. That's not failure, that's data. And now the next decision gets better. Instead of randomly moving, you adjust based on what you just learned. You shift elevation, you shift aspect, maybe you change timing, you reposition within the same system. Now you're building. This is how patterns start to show up. Patterns don't appear all at once, they emerge over time. You've got to start noticing where elk are bedding mid slope instead of high, or movement is happening later in the morning, or north facing timber is holding more activity, or pressure is pushing elk into tighter pockets. Individually, those might seem small, but when you stack them together, they create clarity. Now you're not guessing, you're recognizing. And once you recognize patterns, your decisions get faster and more accurate. This is where consistency is built. At this point, your hunt starts to feel different. You're not just wandering, you're not reacting emotionally, you're narrowing your focus. You're staying in elk longer, you're adjusting with purpose. And because of that, you start getting into more situations that make sense. That's where opportunity comes from, not from luck, not from one perfect decision either, but from a series of connected decisions that keep putting you closer to the right place at the right time. Most elk hunters quit right before this happens. This is the part most people never realize, because stacking information, it takes time. And before it starts paying off, it feels like nothing is working. That's when a lot of hunters leave. They switch areas, they abandon their approach, they go back to guessing, and they miss the moment where things were about to turn, because opportunity doesn't show up randomly, it has to build. Repeatable opportunity is the goal. This is the end state, not just finding elk once, but getting into situations over and over and over again where elk movement, terrain, wind, and timing all start lining up. That's when elk hunting becomes repeatable. That's when your confidence changes, and that's when you stop hoping and start expecting. Not expecting success every time, but expecting that what you're doing is putting you in the right position. And that's the difference. You don't become consistent by knowing more. You become consistent by connecting what you already know, right? You stack information, you build patterns, you refine decisions. Because when you do that long enough, opportunity stops feeling random and starts becoming repeatable. Most hunters are closer than they think. They're putting in the effort, they're spending the time, they're doing a lot of the right things, but those things aren't connected. And that's why results still feel inconsistent and random. This checklist isn't about necessarily doing more. It's about doing things with more structure. When you connect your e-scouting to movement, your fitness to your terrain, your shooting to real conditions, your decisions to elk behavior, everything starts to tighten up. You're going to stop guessing and you're going to start understanding more about elk. And when that happens, elk hunting changes. Opportunities don't feel random anymore and they start to make more sense. That's the goal. Not perfection and definitely not luck either, though. Consistency. So don't overcomplicate this. Start applying these steps, build your system, and let each piece support the next. Because when your hunt is built the right way, results are going to follow. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person elk camp this summer, Elk Camp 2026, that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real time. 90% of Elk Camp is going to be running you through scenarios. You can check Elk Camp out at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.